Good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here, the first visitors of the Vienna Humanities Festival's third day program. As you probably noticed already, Jascha Munk is not with us. He had a serious health issue in the family which kept him back home. But I'm sure that we'll have an interesting conversation about a similar topic, and namely populism versus democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. I already have a question whether this versus is well placed there, or whether it shouldn't be as part of democracy, but probably this will be part of the discussion. We have today with us Piotr Buras, who comes from Poland. He is a political analyst working with the European Council for Foreign Relations there. And he will be introduced by Tim Judah, who is the journalist working with the Economist in London. Both are fellows this month at EVM, Institut für die Wissenschaften für Menschen, with its Europe's Futures program. So, enjoy the conversation. I hand to you, Tim.
Thank you very much. Well, as you can see, that there's been some bad news. Unfortunately, Jascha Munk couldn't be here, but the good news is that we're going to make a better panel. And that's why Piotr was chosen to talk about this, this topic. A former journalist with Gazeta Wyborcza and Berlin correspondent, I believe, and now head of ECR, the European Council on Foreign Relations Office in Warsaw. Well, if you believe, like us, that somehow united Europe is a good thing, then the news of the last few years from Britain, from France, from Italy, and of course from Hungary and Poland and other parts of Central Europe has been quite depressing. We're going to focus on Central Europe, but perhaps we shouldn't only talk about Central Europe. Some of the ideas of Munk talk about illiberal democracy and undemocratic liberalism. Piotr is going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to discuss a bit, and then we're going to sort of open it up. But perhaps I should just start off by asking you, the title of this talk, as we've heard, is Populism and versus Democracy. But maybe that's wrong. It's not actually versus democracy, is it? It's really populism versus liberalism, perhaps. But anyway, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much for all of you who came to attend this this meeting, despite the fact that I'm clearly not Jascha Munk, and it's certainly very disappointing for many of you. But I will try to indeed to say a few words about the topic which we described as populism versus democracy, which is of course a provocation, because as Tim rightly pointed out, it's not the real problem is populism versus liberalism. That should be the real title of our conversation. But there are, of course, some important reasons why one should believe that populism is also a threat to democracy. But let's start with some very brief explanation, which would maybe draw to some extent upon Jascha Munk's very good book. Munk writes in his books that there is an inherent tension in the liberal democracy as a concept between liberalism and democracy. And the democratic principle is clearly, we know it from history, is much older than liberalism, and doesn't have actually much to do with that. It means in the essence that as many important decisions as possible in a given public sphere are taken by popular majorities of equal citizens. And this majoritarian aspect, this majoritarianism, can be limited only if the majoritarian rule could possibly stop some citizens from participating in the democratic decision process. And the liberal principle is clearly different. It places emphasis on the fundamental value of the individual, of individual rights, and it places emphasis on the assumption that the legitimate scope of public power is limited. And those limits are laid out in a constitution which introduces a system of separation of power, checks and balances. And the system makes sure that the individual and minority rights can be protected. And what we experience today is in fact not an attack against the democratic principle as I described it, but much more against the liberal principle. And when I'm saying that, I'm talking about the origins of the current crisis of the liberal democracy and about the motivations of its opponents. And if and how the assault against liberalism may translate into a demolition of democracy itself is a different question. But I believe that this distinction is very important. And not at least against the background of our historical experience and some analogies which are drawn today with the pre-war time and the rise of authoritarianism in Europe back then. In the 30s or 20s, the dissatisfaction and despair of wide ranges of social groups in many European countries, including Poland, was channeled by political forces towards a fundamental rejection of parliamentarianism, party state, and democracy in the end. In this country, I think a particular document, a certain document, Kronenburger Eid, is probably very well known. A document issued 1930 by Heimwehr, this right-wing radical military organization which paved the way for the conservative dictatorship. And this document, for example, says in German, wir verwerfen den westlichen demokratischen Parlamentarismus und den Parteienstaat. We denounce the Western democratic party system and or party state and parliamentarianism. And the same was true actually for Poland under Piłsudski and for many other countries. But I think the difference to the 30s is that's not just the fact that the erosion of the liberal democratic foundations is taking place today without military violence, but also that this democratic principle as such is not really put in question, just the opposite. The populists claim that they represent the real democracy and they want to have more democracy and more of the majoritarian principle, more of the rule of the majority. And moreover, the change is sought not by means of installing a strong leader in a revolutionary manner, but rather by introducing a change step by step, sort of salami tactics, and what is very important, under a formal adherence to the electoral rules, and which is even more important, by seeking a formal and broad democratic legitimacy. And I would argue that what may emerge from this process is not something we know very well from the past, but rather a new sort of hybrid political system, one which perhaps resembles more the Russian or current Russian or Turkish regimes, even if, at least for the time being, they does not, I mean, Poland and Hungary do not come close to that examples. But it would be a system which enjoys indeed support of a sufficient part of the society to claim a high level of the legitimacy, but at the same time is narrowing the space for the opposing voices, which entrenches itself in the state and economic structures of the country, and in effect renders a democratic change less and less likely to happen, or even impossible. And you can call it illiberal democracy or neo-authoritarianism. What counts is that its rise is a phenomenon which almost nobody in Europe expected to emerge. So the question is, how did we get there? And the more disturbing question for us in Central Eastern Europe is how unique is actually our adventure with populism. We can, of course, consolidate ourselves by saying that each and every country in Europe has its own Kaczynski or Orban, but we shouldn't fool ourselves. It is, at the moment, only Poland and Hungary which do away with the separation of powers. It is, apart from Italy, only the Visegrad countries where the populists are really in power, or have at least really running the governments. And that in a situation where Slovakia and Poland have been the fastest growing economies in Europe over the last decade. And all of these countries were basically seen as examples of very successful economic and democratic transformation. So what has happened then? I don't want to convince you that populism is in Central Eastern Europe a regional specialty like goulash or pierogi. And I believe that despite all those problems which we are facing, the EU enlargement was a good thing, and had it not taken place, Europe would be a much more unpleasant place to live now. But I'm convinced that the Central and Eastern European crisis has something very genuine, and that the backlash against liberalism in Central Eastern Europe is particularly strong and successful. So the question is why? So let me offer maybe 4 ideas which could hopefully help us better understand this specific problem with populism in Central Eastern Europe. And first is, of course, economics does matter. And despite the general success of the transformation in Central Eastern Europe, which can be measured by growth rates and falling unemployment, the questions of distribution and pain of change certainly do matter. And even if the economic cycle and the level of wealth in Central Eastern Europe have been different than in Western Europe, the grievances among the people related to this relative deprivation have been roughly the same. So in this sense, I think when it comes to economy, the new Europe is not really so much different from Western Europe. What is, I think, more relevant is what I would call a conflation of liberalism and neoliberalism as a collective experience in Central Eastern Europe. Or put it in a simpler way, the experiment of establishing the foundation of a liberal democratic state in parallel with a radical market economic transformation. And I think that this makes Central Eastern Europe special. And why? Because the Eastern Europe has experienced a completely different path from Western Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War. That was, in Western Europe, you had this Trente Glorieuses, the 30 years of economic development, leveling down of social inequalities, the promise of fairness. And that was the time where the liberal democracies in Western Europe got stabilized. That was what Tony Judd described as the social democratic era in the European history. And neoliberalism was in the West actually only a later correction, even if we can it as a completely misguided correction. That was a correction to some problems which resulted from the overblown state services, indebtedness, and so on and so forth. Central and Eastern Europe developed on a completely different path. When its democratic systems were established after the fall of communism, they experienced a neoliberal era, not a social democratic era. And the result was a progressing individualization in the society at the expense of social capital. It was a deepening of the lack of mutual trust. It was clearly a process which did not create this kind of social cohesion like in the West, rather the opposite. And this transition process initiated fragmentation of the society, which used to be actually more equal in a, of course, sort of peculiar sense, but still the differences within the society were rising in inequalities. But what is perhaps more important is the very idea of the state. That is, a concept of a strong state was basically rejected by the elites. And in a way, the transformation in Central Eastern Europe brought about very strong economies, quite atomized societies, and states not delivering enough public goods. And for these reasons, I would argue this regional version of adventure with neoliberalism undermined the foundation of liberalism as such. And the second idea why Central Eastern Europe is sort of different is linked to that, and I think it's an often underestimated phenomenon, which is basically the absence of the left. And of course it shouldn't come as a surprise, because the leftist ideology was compromised by the era of communism, and but it's of course not that the left parties were not in power. The ex-communist party in Poland came back to power as early as 1993. But what is more important is that the left agenda was almost non-existent. The political and economic liberalism was the only game in town, clearly, and the left was discredited. Basically, the whole political class subscribed to the Washington Consensus. But it is not, what I'm saying is it shouldn't be understood as just a criticism of neoliberal thought. But the real problem is that this created a rather dysfunctional party systems. Because the politics of Central Eastern Europe has never been characterized by this left-right dichotomy, which had I would argue, a stabilizing effect in Western societies, considering the fact that both left and right were part of the pro-liberal democratic consensus. And in Central Eastern Europe, the result was a very vulnerable political system. And Anton Chekhov wrote a very renowned expert on populism and right-wing parties. He wrote once very rightly that when liberal parties fail, democratic alternatives are not always available in Central Eastern Europe. And this is exactly what happened in Poland with Kaczynski. That was exactly what happened with Hungary, in Hungary with Orban. They were the only alternatives to the liberal elites who had lost the confidence of the voters. Then the third point I wanted to make, and perhaps is perhaps the most important one, and it is a paradox, because the rise of populism in Central and Eastern Europe is often seen as a reflection of an inferiority complex, disappointment with Europe, or identity crisis. But actually, when you look closer, the opposite is true. Arguably, Kaczynski's and Orban's success would have been much less likely to happen without the safety net offered by the European Union and the successful transformation and membership in NATO and in the EU. But even more importantly, I think the psychological state of mind which underlies the current political transformation and which gives boost to the populist is not only, or not in the first place, that of a feeling of weakness. It's rather actually a feeling of strength in those countries. And where it comes from and how relevant it is, it can be best explained against the background of what Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes recently called the policy of imitation, to describe the post-1989 transformation. And this transformation was, in Central Eastern Europe, strongly informed by a certain myth of the West and the ideology of catching up with Western Europe, or the ideology or the idea of becoming like the West. And it is not just that the multiple EU crises and even more fundamental crises of the West have undermined the foundation of the myth of the West, or the myth of the EU as a safe harbor, source of identity, and a promise of a better future. As Krastev and Holmes rightly noticed, while in 1989 liberalism was associated with appealing ideals of individual freedom, legal fairness, and governmental transparency, in 2010 it had been tainted by 2 decades of association with really existing and inevitably faulty post-communist governments. But I think there is even more to that. And despite this populist rhetoric about, for example, Poland as a ruined country after 30 years of transformation, and that was the language of Kaczynski, and despite the unsatisfied aspirations in large parts of the society, which helped a lot the rise of Kaczynski or Orban, there is also, paradoxically, a new sort of self-confidence and pride they can build upon to break with this imitation narrative and even claim moral or political superiority with regard to Western Europe. And this is what I referred as this new feeling of strength. That's a paradox, that 30 years ago the West was seen as, the West was strong and the East was weak. And today the roles have in a way inverted. The Western Europe is morally rotten, economically inefficient, protectionist. It hasn't learned from the mistakes of multiculturalism, while the blooming economy and national homogeneity in Central Eastern Europe are seen as sources of stability. And this rhetoric, very much exploited by Orban or Kaczynski, may come across as very anti-Western or anti-European, and indeed remind of Putin's tirades. But it is actually framed differently. The PIS, the Kaczynski party, and its supporters, they believe that Poland represents today the real West, whereas Western Europe has betrayed Western values. And since this transformation of European societies has been consciously driven by the left liberal elites of the 1968 generation, that is the narrative, Kaczynski believes that it can be consciously also rolled back. And Poland may play an important role driving the EU to its genuine cultural roots. An important and last and often cited explanation is that Central and Eastern Europe is particularly xenophobic or nationalist. I'm not sure if it is completely right. I think certainly not in this generality. But I think what is indisputable is that the strength of conservative and national traditions, which can be easy mobilized in times of crisis by political leaders, is quite significant. And this is, in a way, not surprising that anti-liberalism draws upon conservative or right-wing traditions, because the people in times of crisis seek sort of stability by drawing upon the ideas of religion, nation, and so on and so forth. But I think in Central Eastern Europe it is even more apparent because of the lack of any strong leftist traditions. So when you want to reject liberalism, you can basically draw only on conservative or nationalistic, basically, tradition if you look at the past. And also what comes on the top of that is that the pre-war nationalism has never been really discredited in Central Eastern Europe, and the fact that in the history of the region, the evil always or mostly came from abroad, not from within, like, let's say, in Germany, in Austria, in Italy, in some other countries. It is, of course, another element which supports this kind of attitude and also makes defensive and mistrustful sentiments even more plausible. I would like to finish with just three very brief questions, which I honestly don't have any definite answers to, but I think which are key if we want to ask ourselves what the future could bring. And the first question is exactly the title. I mean, the question is, as much as liberalism and democracy are on the ground of theory, two different animals, can their progressing separation from one another not damage democracy? So can illiberal democracies exist or not slide into authoritarianism? I'm very skeptical. In Hungary since 2010, the process of democratic backsliding has never stopped. And John Locke famously wrote that where the law ends, tyranny starts. And the assault on the rule of law is ongoing, both in Hungary and Poland. And the second question is if the West European political system are resilient enough to defend itself against the threat of this new authoritarianism. Because so far the populists in many European countries have successfully invaded the political sphere, they changed the public discourse, they affected political culture, the politics is becoming more messy, but the fundamental structures of liberal democratic system are still in place. And this is the key difference to Poland and Hungary. But the question is, will it hold? And the third, I think, most fundamental question is about the EU. The EU is based upon a principle of constitutional pluralism. So it means that each state is basically allowed to define its own political system or political structures. But the question is how far this constitutional pluralism can go, and how define the red lines. And can we live in a EU with illiberal, semi-authoritarian, liberal, democratic, maybe, I don't know, different kinds of regimes? And if we cannot, so what instruments the EU has at its disposal to prevent the disintegration resulting from the collapse of liberalism, which is now happening? I hope we can dive into these few questions in our
well, thank you very much. Just before we began this, Piotr, I asked you whether you were writing a book, and you looked surprised and said no. But this looks like a book struggling to get out here. So I'm hoping to read it in book form, and maybe next year then we'll dispense with Yasha Monk and come back with your book. Sorry, can you hear me all right? Can everyone hear me all right? Good. Well, this is obviously kind of alarming and scary, but perhaps I can just start off by asking you about Poland, since obviously you're from Poland, know it better. I mean, this question of irreversibility. I mean, how far are we from this kind of proper state capture, or has it already happened in Poland? And is it already becoming irreversible, especially if there's no credible opposition?
Yeah, I think it's happening under our eyes, and it has happened to a large extent already. I mean, the last news because the big thing in Poland is indeed the capture of the judicial system by the party, the full control of the judiciary. So this is the background of these discussions we have with the European Commission. There is an infringement procedure against Polish legislation on the Supreme Court and others. And this is indeed a fundamental issue about the separation of powers and the question how far the executive can control the judiciary and if it can control it at all. But the question is how far it can go, and I think what we observe both in Poland and Hungary is how the political leaders are testing the limits, and this is on and over again. The last news from Poland is that there is a reform planned now by the Minister of Justice, a reform of the legislation on the journalistic and barristers' secret, you say, or you know that there are some
sources. Are you talking about
sources? Yes, I mean the revealing sources about the how and when the barristers or journalists are obliged to reveal their sources. So this is normally, in the normal situation, it is a court, independent court, which basically determines that a journalist or a barrister has to reveal his or her source. According to the new legislation which is planned and it has become public, it would be the prosecutor who would decide if a barrister or a journalist has to reveal sources. The prosecutor general in Poland, so it means the boss of all prosecutors in the country, is the Minister of Justice in Poland. So it means basically that there would be a case against the Minister of Justice, which is actually taking place. I mean, there are cases where the Minister of Justice is sued for overstepping basically his mandate. The Minister of Justice could ask the prosecutor to let the barrister defending or representing the people claiming against the minister to reveal the source of whatever information. So this is, I'm not sure if this law is going to pass, but it is happening. I mean, this is happening. It's and so that's why my skepticism about you know, is it possible basically to change the course?
And what's the answer?
I'm skeptical.
I mean, you think you are?
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, in Hungary, the situation is, I think, in a sense, much worse because the Orban system has been entrenched in the structures of the country of the state. Is entrenched in the economic structures. It's based upon a certain oligarchy, and I think the Polish regime is still not there. But we are facing parliamentary elections next year, and that will be the most important election over the last 30 years. Because if this election is lost by the Liberals, I think we will be making very big steps in the direction of sort of semi-authoritarian regime.
And if that, well, you've made a case that the roots of it in Central and Eastern Europe are different, but it's not. You know, Central and Eastern Europe is not by itself. I mean, we've seen what's happening in Italy, for example, and then we've got the European elections in May. So we're going to have probably commissioners, you know, real kind of believers or party of these parties and of these increasingly authoritarian regimes in Europe. So what does that mean for the European Union itself? Are we going to be transforming the European Union, or will they be transforming it from the inside, or will we be setting up a clash between these kind of authoritarian forces and those who oppose them, like Macron in France? And if so, what does that mean for the future?
I think this is indeed what is at the moment at stake in Europe, and the next year parliamentary election will be EP election. The election to the European Parliament will be indeed a big confrontation between those political forces in the nation states, in the member states, which have a completely different idea of not only of society but to some extent also of the political system, and those who try to defend a certain set of values which are, you know, fundamental for to my understanding of the European Union. And I think there is a sort of a, we can observe a pan-European international, in a way, being created by a variable system of alliances between Salvini, Orban, Strache, AfD in Germany, and Kaczynski in Poland. And it's, I'm not saying that they are already forming a coherent political group, but all of them are challenging indeed the fundamentals of the European Union. And I think this is what requires a reaction from not only from liberal political forces, but also for civil society, from you know, I would say European parties. For me, the main battle today, the main political battle, is has been playing out not in between the liberals and the populists, but actually within the European center-right. Because this is what's happening in the European People's Party. The question of should Viktor Orban remain member of the same political grouping with Angela Merkel and Sebastian Kurz and other you know, traditional conservative Christian democratic parties. I think this is in a way really the political, not legalistic, a political battle for ideas. I mean, and I think the threat is that the political mainstream, which is still, you know, very much center-right, I think, in Europe. This is at least in terms of the political parties, the center-right is still the strongest political camp. My fear is that not that the populists will gain power in the next European election and would completely reshape the European structures, but rather that they will change the way how the European center-right thinks and acts. And I think this is even more dangerous because it's much less visible.
Well, it's basically the classic sort of the right is shifting further right, yeah, and perhaps drawing the rest of the centre further right with it. Yeah. But of course you're quite right about these sort of links, and just as a sort of anecdote, this morning I was following a link by Macedonian journalist. Tomorrow, of course, is the referendum in Macedonia on the change of name, which certainly some in that camp, you know, are championing, and well, not a no vote. They want a boycott because it's to do with, or they say to do with the question of identity. But the interesting thing about the link, which was written by, it was an article by a Macedonian journalist who's against the change of name and in campaigning for a boycott, was that it was published in English. It was published on a website, a new Slovene website in English, which was then full of articles about Hungary and Poland and Christianity and identity, also mixed in with articles about the discovery of Atlantis and other kind of strange and weird things. But still, before we kind of just open and discuss with everybody else here, I mean, is there any kind of chink of light, or is there any light at the end of the tunnel? Is there anything to be optimistic about if one believes, like us, in a kind of liberal and united Europe?
I don't know. I don't want to be you know, too pessimistic, but I think we are really in a very long haul. It's not that we can expect some very fast changes and reversal of this trend, at least in Central Eastern, at least in my country or in Hungary, in a very short term. I mean, of course, one thing is important. It is not that in Poland, unlike in Hungary, but I think even in Hungary, there is not an overwhelming majority supporting Orban. This is apparently, this is not even a majority. It's even less than 50% of people who effectively would like to vote for Orban. In Poland is the picture, the right picture is also of a very polarized, extremely divided country. And in this sense, it would be foolish to say that, you know, everything is lost and there is no light in the tunnel, and that, but you know, that's the big picture. I think the society is much more liberal, or the part of the society is much more liberal than the electoral results would suggest. And the general picture you have from the media, from you know, news and from what I have just said, but but my skepticism is based upon just a very sober analysis of political trends and electoral surveys, and I'm worried that this trend, despite the fact that we have a polarized society, that we have a divided country, and that part of society is by far not happy with what's going on, that this can continue.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, let's open it up now. I'm not quite sure if there are microphones. Is there someone with a microphone, or? Oh, you've got microphones. Fine. Okay. Great. Well, please, when you ask a question, please just stand up and just introduce yourself, and perhaps we'll take a group of three. But over there.
Thanks. My name is Rosa Balfour. I'm a non-resident fellow at the IWM with Piotr and Tim. First thing, Piotr, I'd like to agree with Tim. This is at least a long essay, what you just presented us, so I think you could turn it into a book. But I'd like to challenge you a little bit on your definition of democracy, and I might be wrong, but I've heard this a couple of times over the past few days. My impression is that your definition of democracy is pretty thin. It's the skeleton, the classic, so separation of powers, elections, and regulation of negative freedoms. And then the liberal democracy is a kind of the sort of pluralist addition. Now, in my understanding, and there is loads of literature about this, in the European context, liberal democracy, the liberal piece actually refers to how you regulate your economy, and it doesn't refer to the nature of democracy. And if you look at European history, democracy in itself has a lot more quality to it and has a lot more depth. It's also about positive freedoms, it's about pluralism, and in the European and EU context, it's also about a whole set of political, economic and social and even cultural rights, okay, that's a bit more controversial, that are constitutionalized. So in my view, if you talk about democracy, the question of liberal or illiberal is not, that illiberal democracy essentially is an oxymoron. So I'd just like to prod you a little bit on that, because I think that's important for the conclusions that you then draw about illiberal democracy. I don't think that is, you know, so the justification that the Kaczynskis and Orbáns have that this is a democracy, but it's majoritarian and thus liberal, it doesn't mean it's not a democracy, that's wrong. That those two things are not, they can't exist together. So that would be my challenge. I think partly the reason for which there is confusion is because a lot of the schools on democracy are American, where liberal democracy, the liberal piece refers more to pluralism, etc. But that definition in a European context, to me, is a rather neoliberal definition of democracy, if you see what I mean. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I suggest that we have like 3 questions or comments. Would anyone like to follow up with that? Come on, don't be shy. Good, okay. Please don't forget, tell us who you are and go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Ah, okay, it's on. It's not on.
Sorry, it was.
I think you just have to have it close to you.
Sorry, so possibly. Okay.
Angel Petrov, and I'm a Bulgarian journalist working for a news website. You said, Mr. Buras, that the liberal voters or liberal citizens are much more than manifested from voting results. Then why do, in many cases, in many countries, in many recent elections, do these liberal voters stay home? if so much is at stake, is it just because they don't see a credible alternative to these parties? Because apparently the alternative to these populist parties is to keep the system that they like and they apparently take for granted. Why do you think it happens?
Okay, can I just ask you a question? If you're from Bulgaria, how many people are on the voting roll in Bulgaria, and how many people live in the country? Because this also has something to do with it.
Oh, it's something like 7 million people. Of course, this is a matter of debate.
On the voting roll is 7 million.
Yeah, we can say it's something about 7 million.
But is there a big difference between the voting roll and the?
It's not like Macedonia.
That's what I'm.
It's
not
like Macedonia.
Okay, fine. Okay, because sometimes statistics can get distorted about this question of who's staying at home, but actually, if they're not in the country, then it's a difference. Okay, third one, the lady over there. Lady over there.
My name is Elizabeth Al-Himrani. I'm from Vienna, retired employee of an airline. What I was missing now, I was a bit late, but what I was missing now in the definition of democracy, liberal democracy, is the guarantee of a free judiciary. What is, I mean, Orban has made in his way, and I think in Poland too, and what we see now in what is going on in America is, I mean, the most significant example.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, Piotr, you've got 3 questions there. One from a challenge from Rosa. The question: why don't voters go out and vote? And judiciaries. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. And I think I will answer the first and the third question together, because it refers to the same problem of definition of liberal democracy. And I think probably there is no disagreement between us, because I don't buy the argument that you can have an illiberal democracy. I don't buy it either. My point was only and in fact, you know, the independence of judiciary, as you rightly pointed out, is for me an indispensable part of liberal democratic system. I talked about it at the very beginning, so perhaps where you weren't there. But I think what I was the point I was trying to make is that this majoritarianism, which is actually the main feature of this populist concept of democracy, at least in Poland, in Hungary, and it's not trying to make a point against the democracy as such, as it used to be the case in those who questioned the political system in the 20s and in the 30s. But it is much more, you know, sophisticated way of undermining the indeed democratic foundations of the system. And this is something, I think this is a new quality, because if I talk with the Hungarians, but also not only with Hungarians, also with politicians in Europe who say, okay, but actually, you know, Orban still enjoys democratic legitimacy, and this is somewhat true, because it's not that the elections in Hungary were not free. I think they weren't fair, but they were free, and yeah, so they were not fair, but nobody forced anybody to vote for Orban. I mean that's the point. Nobody, you know, there were no sanctions for voting for different parties, like, you know, it was the case in the communist time in
True, but as I was saying, you do have public broadcasters which have turned into ruling party broadcasters. So yes, it does make a kind of big difference.
Yeah, I think it is. I'm not, as I say, I'm not. This is my I'm using your argument in my discussions with those who defend Orban, but I just want to make this point, because I think it is really a sort of a new phenomenon, this new authoritarianism, as some people describe it. But I agree that in the long run it's not you know, in line with the democratic principles. And then with the question of voting behavior, I think I'm not I'm political analyst. I'm not a theorist or I'm not an academic, but this is a very big issue in also in the studies on democracy and in political science. Is it really necessary that for a democratic system to work that many people go to vote? I think it's not the conclusion that if you have 90% turnout, it is a better functioning democracy. Is probably would be also far-fetched. But it's true, and I think this is I'm not saying that your question is not important. It's an extremely important one, because the fact is that we now, if you look at the Polish politics, the main question today is how to make sure that those people who basically don't like the current government, that they realize that something important is at stake, because they obviously haven't yet realized or do not agree that something very important is at stake. And this is, we had, but to show the dimension of this problem, the last parliamentary election in Poland, 2015, we had a turnout of 50%. The Kaczynski party got 39% of votes. So they got basically not even 20% of eligible votes of eligible citizens, and the party claims to represent the whole Polish society, the will of the people, and so on and so forth. Okay, but where is the rest? Where are the people? And the one thing is that it's a very constant feature of the Polish politics, that the turnout has always been extremely low. I mean, extremely low. 50% is actually very low in the national elections. So it hasn't been any change over the last 30 years. And so this is something which even the best experts in electoral behavior are a bit confused about what is actually the reason. But there is also a reason, I think, today on the sort of supply side, that and this is about how the opposition is positioning itself. And I'm not going to criticize the civic platform, the main opposition party, which is a liberal conservative, but rather my point is again about the left. That I'm pretty sure that if we do not have a relatively strong left party in Poland with a good leader, we will not be able to remove the Kaczynski party from power for another few years. Because Kaczynski has stolen, to put it in a drastic way, the social agenda, and no liberal party can regain the ground because it would be not basically legitimate, or it would not be credible as a defender of social rights. So the left is absolutely needed as a party which could form a coalition with the liberal conservatives in order to replace the Kaczynski party in power. And I think that's and here, if you don't, there are many voters in Poland who would like to probably oppose Kaczynski, but who believe that voting for the current opposition is not an option. So the question is, will something emerge? Will something new emerge? Will the political supply, look better?
All right, thank you. The question judiciary, you dealt with that.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I dealt with that. I hope I answered.
Okay, great. Who would like to be somebody over there, please?
Hi there. I'm Lex Alexander, and also from the Institute. I'm not sure that you really answered Rosa's question, because it seems to me that she wasn't only asking you about your definition of democracy, she was also questioning your definition of liberalism. And I think this is important because if we're going to understand the failure of the centre in Europe, we have to look at their economic policies and the way they failed the majority of people. And if you simply try to defend the middle, whether you call it liberal democracy or whether you talk about a left version, one needs to think about their economic policies and how the left might be different from the centre. Now, I think there are some alternatives, and I think sometimes the left is attractive to people, whether it's in the form of a kind of left social democracy like Corbyn and in France, or whether it's in the form of a more popular democracy that's arisen out of some of the mass struggles. So I think you have to take these things on board, and I think if you do, you end up with a different picture from the one that you and many other people that I've heard speaking here come up with. It's not such a pessimistic picture. There are people who are trying to pose alternatives. So let me ask you about the methodology, because your methodology, you explained at the end, was looking at opinion polls and looking at election results mainly. I'm sure you've done other things. But what happens if you extend your methodology to look at the actual struggles on the ground that people are fighting, the mobilizations that we see against racism, for instance, in many countries? Would you draw the same conclusions if you broadened your methodology, if you move beyond being a political scientist, perhaps, to becoming more of a sociologist, let me put it that way? Does that shape the kind of conclusions that you're drawing? Now, I should perhaps say that I have the great privilege of coming from Africa, not from Europe. And so it gives one a different slant on these things, gives one a different perspective. But I think that perspective is a helpful one. Now, you could draw the conclusion that what's happening in Europe is a consequence of the defeat of all of the uprisings that occurred in the wake of Tunisia and Egypt and so on. Now, if that is your argument, I'd be very grateful to hear it. Or it could be that you would say that the kind of mobilisations that I'm talking about are relatively minor. But if they're minor, why do they persist? What are people getting out of them? And are there opportunities to build on them? When you talk about a left in Poland, if it's just a matter of you and friends and so on talking about the need for a left, I'm really very sceptical. There is a problem there.
I didn't understand the last.
I'm saying that at the end, your conclusion of the last contributions was to say we need a left alternative. No, that's fine, but I would like to know what that left alternative is based upon, because if it's just ideas and academics and so on saying we need it, then I think it's doomed to failure. If it's a left alternative that is based upon mass mobilization, then it becomes a different question altogether.
All right, thank you very much. The lady there, thank you, please.
Zsuzsa Szelényi from Hungary. I'm also a fellow of Piotr and Rosa and Tim. And, well, I actually would like to go on this issue on what liberalism and what is not, because I think it's also very interesting. I just want to share with you the Hungarian experience. In terms of, it's also very much related to what Piotr explained, that it's the change, actually, the authoritarian change or illiberal change comes from the center. It's so much the case that Viktor Orbán named his regime or his strategic aim like 10 years ago, like formulate the center force field. And when he got to power, he called it a national system of cooperation. So there is he opened up a national system of cooperation. He embodies the entire nation, not only the right, where he is actually in the European field he is placed. He embodies the entire nation. And as you say, he introduced a lot of social policies, which is considered to be leftist. So I understand very well when Piotr says the liberals, what is the liberal alternative, because actually it's really not the left-right axis any longer, at least in our countries, but an authoritarian versus liberal. And I would like to know a bit more what you think can be, when you say liberal, Piotr, can be a kind of rising agenda for the next election. So what can be, which collect all those people who want to change the current situation.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we're going to have to finish on time, so I'm not going to take any more questions, but if you would like to continue the discussion, Piotr will be around, we'll be around a bit. So we've got about 2 minutes, so could you just...
Yes, I will do my best. I think
we're just getting going, and then we've got to stop. So
yeah, please. Just to the first question, there was a bunch of extremely interesting remarks, to be honest, and I certainly would have to answer some of them. I would probably think a bit longer than give an immediate response. But I think the one point is probably important. I mean, this is the understanding of liberalism, and this is what I was saying, and I was very much focusing on Central Eastern Europe and on the. I'm not talking about the left alternatives in the UK or anywhere else. I was very much focused on how we see it from our Central Eastern European perspective, and how liberalism is also defined in Central Eastern Europe, and clearly the question of liberal economic reforms and their fallout is part of the problem and part of our conversation also in Poland and Hungary, and I think this is also some implications or negative implications, or some mistakes which have been made over the time. They also can explain the course of affairs today. I think I didn't say that it was not the case, but I think with liberalism is also one question very important. This is I just wanted to make this point, and that the question of pluralism and how encompassing should be the definition of liberal democracy. I think this is exactly what the populists attack. They have a very, the question of pluralism or certain values, LGBT rights, and so on and so forth. This is exact in our societies, at least, but not only here. I think this is exactly the point of contention. And this is where these opposition to the idea of liberal democracy comes from, because they claim that it is not just a certain model of state or democracy, structures, institutions, which needs to be implemented in order to be a liberal democracy, but also a certain set of very particular values, which are imposed by the West on Central Eastern European societies. And this is indeed a much, I think, not less important battle in Poland, in Hungary, than the one, but also in whole Europe, than the one about structures, rule of law, independent judiciary, and so on.
Great. Well, thank you very much. As I said, it's unfortunate. I just feel like the debate is about to get going, but we've got to stop. But it's a debate in general, which is obviously going to be dominating Europe, and not just Central and Eastern Europe, for the next few years, if not the next generation. Well, thank you very much to the festival for inviting us, and for IWM and everybody else who's behind the festival, and for us being here. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day.